Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The beginning of the end. That's what many are saying about the Trump presidency following the Washington Post's explosive expose revealing how President Trump disclosed highly classified intelligence during his sit-down meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak at the White House last week. Only one day after Trump fired FBI Director James Comey over his investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to influence the 2016 election. Citing unnamed U.S. officials, the Post reports Trump began bragging to the two Russian officials about his intelligence briefings, saying, quote, "I get great intel. I have people brief me on great intel every day." Trump went on to disclose highly classified information provided by a third party about the possible threat of ISIS launching an attack on an airplane using a computer bomb. This is the Washington Post's Greg Miller, one of the co-authors of the article.
At some point, Trump starts talking about the great intelligence he gets. He's telling his visitors, I get the best briefings, I get the best intelligence, and proceeds to talk about this threat that is underway that has been actually publicly talked about for some time. But he goes into details about the specifics of this plot and how it's coming together and what the Islamic State is doing to try to pull this off. And the problem is that the United States knows much of this information because of intelligence that came from a partner, another country.
Senior White House officials were apparently so alarmed by Trump's disclosures they called the CIA and National Security Agency afterward to warn them of what had happened. Officials told the Washington Post they were concerned Trump's disclosure would jeopardize a critical source of intelligence on the Islamic State. There's been some speculation that the country of Jordan was the source of the classified intelligence. President Trump is reportedly scheduled to speak by phone this morning with Jordan's King Abdullah. At an emergency news conference Monday, National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster said the Washington Post story was false.
The story that came out tonight, as reported, is false. The President and the Foreign Minister reviewed a range of common threats to our two countries, including threats to civil aviation. At no time were intelligence sources or methods discussed. And the President did not disclose any military operations that were not already publicly known.
But earlier this morning, President Trump made his first comment on the story, in which he appears to contradict General McMaster and instead confirms he did disclose information to Russia. He wrote on Twitter, quote, "As president, I wanted to share with Russia at an openly scheduled White House meeting, which I have the absolute right to do, facts pertaining to terrorism and airline flight safety. Humanitarian reasons, plus I want Russia to greatly step up their fight against ISIS and terrorism." We'll have more on Trump's leaks to Russia after headlines with Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution here at Stanford University and with Scott Horton, lecturer at Columbia Law School, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars says up to 100 civilians were reportedly killed by U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Iraq's Anbar province Saturday. Residents say the airstrikes continued for 4 hours and hit an internet hall, multiple homes, a stadium, and a cemetery where a funeral of an ISIS fighter was being held. Meanwhile, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says U.S. airstrikes killed at least 30 people, including more than a dozen children, in Syria's eastern province of Deir az-Zor Monday. This comes after U.S. airstrikes on May 11th reportedly killed at least a dozen civilians, including 8 children, north of the Syrian city of Raqqa. 2 days earlier, airstrikes on 2 villages around Raqqa reportedly killed 19 civilians, including at least 5 children. In more news on Syria, the U.S. State Department says it believes the Syrian government's been burning the bodies of those killed at the Sadnaya prison outside Damascus in a crematorium. Amnesty International says the Syrian government has executed up to 13,000 people at the prison since 2011. Physicians for Human Rights said, quote, "If shown to be true, the Syrian government's use of a crematorium demonstrates the extent to which the Syrian government has become a machine that commits mass murder with impunity," unquote. In Yemen, the death toll from a cholera outbreak has risen to 187, as the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign has devastated Yemen's health, water, sewage, and sanitation systems. There are more than 11,000 reported cases of cholera in Yemen, and the International Committee for the Red Cross warns the disease is spreading like wildfire. In Afghanistan, 5 children between the ages of 6 and 10 were killed Sunday when a mortar round exploded as the children were playing cricket. The mortar round was likely fired amidst fighting earlier in the day, but did not explode until the children were playing. The United Nations says fighting in Afghanistan has killed 283 children so far this year. In Mexico, the award-winning journalist Javier Valdez has been assassinated in the northwestern state of Sinaloa. Valdez was a long-time reporter on drug trafficking and organized crime. He wrote for the prominent newspaper La Jornada. He was killed on Monday after armed gunmen opened fire on his car in the city of Culiacan. This is Valdez speaking in 2011 when he won the Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award.
I've been a journalist for 21 years, and never before have I suffered and enjoyed it this intensely, nor with so many dangers. In Culiacan, in the state of Sinaloa, in Mexico, it's a danger to be alive. And to be a journalist is to tread an invisible line determined by the bad guys, who are in drug trafficking and the government, in a field strewn with explosives. This is what most of the country is living through. One must protect oneself from everything and everyone, and there does not seem to be options or salvation, and often there is no one to turn to.
His death marks the 5th reported killing of a journalist in Mexico this year. Only hours after his assassination, gunmen opened fire on another journalist, Sonia Cordoba, and her son, Jonathan Rodriguez Cordoba, in the state of Jalisco. Cordoba is the deputy director of the weekly magazine El Costeño. She survived the attack, is in critical condition. Her son, who also wrote for the magazine, was killed. Mexico is one of the world's most dangerous places to be a journalist. Since 2000, more than 100 journalists have been murdered in Mexico. President Trump is meeting with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan today at the White House. Today's meeting comes amidst tension between U.S. and Turkey over the Pentagon's arming of the Syrian Kurdish militia. During today's meeting, Trump and Erdogan are not expected to discuss the deteriorating human rights situation inside Turkey, where nearly 50,000 people have been arrested, 150,000 public and private workers have been fired, and more than 150 journalists have been imprisoned since last summer's failed military coup. In Seattle, Washington, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments Monday over Trump's second Muslim ban, which sought to ban all refugees and citizens of 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the United States. 2 months ago, a federal judge in Hawaii blocked Trump's revised ban just hours before it was slated to take effect nationwide. This is Neil Katyal, a lawyer representing the state of Hawaii.
The government has not engaged in mass dragnet exclusions, in the past, 50 years. This is something new and unusual, in which you're saying this whole class of people, some of which are dangerous, we can bar them all.
We'll go to Seattle later in the broadcast to speak with Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who filed the first lawsuit against Trump's Muslim travel ban. In more international news, in Japan, thousands of people protested against U.S. military bases on the island of Okinawa Monday as the island marked 45th anniversary of its reversion to Japanese rule. The protesters gathered on the shores near Hanoko to protest a highly controversial new U.S. military base, which began construction in April after years of opposition from residents. For decades, residents have called for the expulsion of U.S. troops from Okinawa, which houses about 2/3 of the 50,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Japan. In El Salvador, the United Nations is calling for an investigation into a string of killings of transgender women. Local LGBTQ groups say at least 17 transgender women have been killed so far this year in El Salvador. The Trump administration said Monday it would vastly expand the so-called global gag rule, a Reagan-era policy that bans U.S. funding for any international healthcare organization that performs abortion or advocates for the legalization of abortion or even mentions abortion, even if those activities are funded by non-U.S. money. The expansion of the global gag rule is expected to affect hundreds of health clinics worldwide, particularly in Africa. The U.S. Supreme Court has dealt a major victory for voting rights activists after it refused to hear an appeal over North Carolina's voter suppression law. Last year, a federal appeals court blocked the law, ruling the measures discriminate against African-American voters and target them with almost surgical precision. On Monday, the Supreme Court announced it would not hear a challenge to the appeals court ruling, meaning the highly restrictive voter ID law will not be reinstated. In Bakersfield, California, dozens of farm workers are recovering after they were exposed to a highly toxic pesticide whose use was recently green-lighted by the EPA in one of the agency's first decisions since Trump took office. Last year, the EPA was on the verge of banning the Dow Chemical Company pesticide, but under EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, the agency unexpectedly reversed course and approved its use. Multiple studies have found the pesticide causes both immediate symptoms, such as vomiting, diarrhea, and blurred vision, as well as long-term damage in children, such as developmental delays and higher rates of autism. And in West Virginia, former police officer Stephen Mader is suing the city of Weirton after he says he was fired from the police department for not shooting a suicidal young man. In May 2016, Officer Mader arrived at the house of a 23-year-old African-American man named Ronald R.J. Williams, Jr., after Williams' girlfriend called the police because he'd threatened to hurt himself. Officer Mader says he found Williams holding a handgun and acting suicidal. Mader says he was trying to de-escalate the situation and was urging Williams to put down the gun when two more police officers arrived. One immediately opened fire, killing Williams. The police later found Williams' gun was not loaded. Officer Mader says 1 month later he was informed he would be fired for, quote, apparent difficulties in critical incident reasoning, unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Stanford University in California.